Welcome, everyone. My name is Kevin O'Neill. I'll give a brief introduction in a moment, but you are here with the event Justice in Uncertain Times, an opportunity for us to both celebrate and engage critically Professor Kamari Clarke's new book, Affective Justice. Again, my name is Kevin O'Neill. I'm a professor and director of the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies here at the University of Toronto, and I am joined by my colleague, Audrey Macklin, professor at the Faculty of Law and director of the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Toronto. As I mentioned, we're here to celebrate and critically engage Professor Kamari Clarke's new book titled Affective Justice, the International Criminal Court and the Pan-Africanist Pushback, published by Duke University Press. Over the next few hours, we will engage with our panelists, and I'll provide a bit of an introduction, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for question and answers. For those who we're all becoming increasingly familiar with this kind of medium, but for those who are engaging us through YouTube, you can enter your questions just in terms of logistics. You can enter your questions into the chat function, and myself and my co-moderator, Professor Macklin, will do the job of collecting them, synthesizing them, and then later posing them in the question and answer session. Before we begin the event today and provide introductions to both our panelists, Professor Clarke, and a bit of a background about the book, let's begin as we always do at the University of Toronto to recognize the land upon which the university occupies with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas, the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. The event today has been organized by the Transnational Justice Project in collaboration with the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies, as well as the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Toronto. And it is an event that is both timely and, speaking as an anthropologist, a book that really has set the horizon for a much larger or longer kind of conversation. What I mean by that is that books, as we know, as many people here know, take years to complete, and it's always difficult to anticipate the kind of world that books will meet, when a book will be published. And so we oftentimes write these books with kind of a long-term horizon, and this book is certainly one of them. There is an enduring kind of contribution that will engage. At the same time, the book emerges in a moment in which questions of justice couldn't be more transnational and couldn't be more global in scale. When we think about Black Lives Matter as not just an issue in the United States, but a global movement, as well as the challenges of the pandemic and increasing urgency of environmental justice, it's worth considering Professor Clarke's affective justice in relationship to these more immediate themes, as well as interrogating some of her contributions that will certainly stand the test of time. Professor Clarke is professor here at the University of Toronto at the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies, as well as the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. We are absolutely thrilled to have her. Over her career, Professor Clarke has taught at Yale University, the University of Pennsylvania, Carleton, and the University of California, Los Angeles. For more than 20 years, Professor Clarke has conducted research on issues related to legal institutions, international legal domains, religious nationalism, and the politics of globalization and race. She spent her career exploring theoretical questions of culture and power, and in the field of law and anthropology, detailing the relationship between new social formations and contemporary problems. One of her key contributions to the various disciplines she inhabits, and there are several: anthropology, international relations, legal theory, religious studies. One of her major contributions has been to demonstrate ethnographically the ways that legal and religious knowledge regimes produce practices that travel globally. By mapping the way that particular cultural forms travel and by highlighting how some travel more than others, she's quickly established herself as a leader in this area and a central interlocutor into new ways of managing power and regulating social practices. Her latest book, which is the reason we have happily joined this conversation and are going to begin this great kind of set of questions and answers is Affective Justice, the International Criminal Court and the Pan-Africanist Pushback. Let me just provide just a kind of some general orientation about the book. It explores the African Union's pushback against the International Criminal Court in order to theorize affect's role in shaping forms of justice in the contemporary period. Drawn on fieldwork in The Hague, the African Union, and the capital of Ethiopia, sites of post-election violence in Kenya and Boko Haram circuits in northern Nigeria, Professor Clarke formulates the concept of affective justice, which she defines as an emotional response to competing interpretations of justice. She does so to trace how affect becomes manifest in judicial practices. By detailing the effects of the International Criminal Court's all-African indictments, Professor Clarke outlines how affective responses call into question how we analyze both those victimized by violence and the perpetrators who enable such violence. Of its many contributions, and we'll hear several today, affective justice provides a fuller theorization of how people articulate what justice is and the mechanisms through which they do so. And so this conversation is a robust one, and we have a number of really great panelists. We see them all here with us today. Let me provide, before we hear from our panelists, let me provide a little bit of introduction for each of them. So Christopher Gevers is a professor of international law and legal theory in the School of Law, University of KwaZulu-Natal. His research focuses on third world approaches to international law, critical race theory, and law and literature. Thank you for joining us, Christopher. Katherine Lemons is Associate Professor of Anthropology at McGill University. She's the author of Divorcing Traditions, Islamic Marriage Law and the Making of Indian Secularism. Her research explores Islamic family law adjudication in India, which is a subject that has implications for understanding Muslim gender and kin relations, secularism, minority politics, and legal pluralism. Nayanika Mookherjee is a professor of political anthropology in Durham University in the United Kingdom. She researches public memories of violent past and aesthetic practices of reparative justice, examined through gendered violence and conflict. One example of her work is The Spectral Wound, published 2015 by Duke University Press. Her work on the memorialization and transnational adoption also contributes to this larger interest in politics. She's published also extensively on anthropology of violence, ethics, and aesthetics. Currently, she's working on her manuscript, Arts of Irreconciliation, and continuing her British Academy-funded research on conflict and transnational adoption. Thank you for being with us today. Njoki Wamai is an assistant professor of international relations at the United States International University, Africa, the oldest private university in Kenya. Njoki wrote her PhD in the politics of international criminal court intervention at the University of Cambridge in 2016. She's a scholar, activist, interested in locating political realities that emerge at the everyday level in African context in the academy. Her work is mainly focused on power, citizenship in the context of international interventionism, and transnational justice in Africa. She also has a sustained interest in African feminisms and decolonial methodologies. We also have here Siba Grovogui. He's a professor of international relations theory and law in the Africana Studies at Research Center at Cornell University. Author of Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns, and Africans, as well as another book, Beyond Eurocentrism and Anarchy. He is currently completing 2 manuscripts. The first explores modern idioms and languages that give expression to the human as an actualization of moral choices and ethical commitments to others. The second examines the past of international relations with particular regard to the identities, values, and roles of multiple agents, subjects, and actors in bringing about international society. Tor Krever is an assistant professor at the University of Warwick School of Law. His current research develops a materialist history of maritime piracy and the ideology of free trade and international legal thought. His broader research interests include critical and Marxist approaches to international law and international economic law, political economy, and international development. He also has a sustained interest in left legal theory. It is a fantastic group of people, scholars and activists, who have come together to engage this really important book. Before we have each of the panelists provide 5 to 8 minutes. 8 seems pretty specific, but I'll do my best as moderator to keep everyone on point. Response to Professor Clarke's book. Let me just highlight some of the themes that we might see in the next conversation or in the kind of upcoming panelists. So again, affective justice theorizes affect's role in shaping forms of justice in the contemporary period. Draws on extensive fieldwork, and she formulates the concept of affective justice, which I can say again, an emotional response to competing interpretations of justice. It's a term that allows her to trace how affect becomes manifest in judicial practices. There is also, if we could also remember that the methodological innovations of this book are also incredibly critical. They're multi-scalar in a way that challenges what within the field of anthropology and those engaged in ethnography would call kind of multi-sided work. It's an innovative methodological approach, which we'll hear much more about today, that allows her to redraw the architecture of international justice through an ethnography that shows how affect is built into the racialized management of mass violence. It's an incredibly innovative point. She doesn't focus on physical sites alone, which is a kind of classic ethnographic move, but deploys creative scaling in order to shift anthropological consciousness of the subject and object. All of which allows her through this book to offer a visionary approach to understanding how liberal legality gains power in contemporary transnational justice formations. And the panel today will consider, among many other themes, the stakes of decentering the constructed universality of the subject amid debates over international justice, which is a great way of beginning or serving as an entree to our first speaker today, which I believe is Professor Lemons, who will begin with some initial thoughts and reactions to Professor Clarke's book, Affective Justice.
Hi, everyone. You can hear me okay? It's really nice to be here. So I just wanted, of course, first to thank Professor Clarke for writing this really compelling book, and of course, for the invitation to participate in responding to it. So I have many, many thoughts about this book, and I had the chance also to contribute to the blog forum about it. And so this is in some ways, I've had a lovely second chance to think about the comments that I wrote before and so on. And I wanted to actually just begin these comments by noting something that Kevin, you just sort of referenced, which is that something one finds out in passing in the beginning of this book is that not only is it hugely impressive in terms of its multi-sided research, but that the way this multi-sided research was carried out was through an equally impressive structure of collaboration, it seems to me. So Professor Clarke mentions in the beginning of the book that she really worked closely with a team of researchers who helped carry out interviews and do ethnographic fieldwork and other kinds of research. And I wanted to start here because of how innovative this is still in the field of anthropology, to do a kind of deeply collaborative study and to think, as Professor Clarke has sort of carefully about how it is that one actually can do multi-sided field research precisely and perhaps only effectively through this kind of collaboration. And as I was drawing together these comments today, I was thinking that, you know, if Professor Clarke, you want to write another book on this book, I would love to actually read, in some sense, the subtext. I would love to hear more about your insights into and contributions to recent discussions, in particular in feminist anthropology, about the possibilities afforded by collaboration in precisely rethinking and in some ways undoing or redoing our discipline of anthropology. A second thing I wanted to dwell on for a moment was, of course, the central piece of this book, which is the effectiveness with which it draws our attention to how important affect is. And it seems to me that this is another of the book's great contributions to anthropology of law, much more broadly than its sort of more constrained field of an anthropology of, let's say, international law or institutions. So in other words, the way in which it brings to the fore the question of affect is at once hugely important for understanding, I think, how law works, but also hugely important for a more specific question, which is often asked of small non-state legal institutions by legal anthropologists, but I have found is much less frequently asked of international institutions. And that question is, what is it that makes non-state legal institutions effective, right? Or as Professor Clarke writes in her book, when they do not have universal jurisdiction, enforcement power, a police force or military, or the assumed loyalty of a citizenry, as the state does, how do legal institutions become effective? And I am really convinced by Clarke's argument that affect is a primary source of non-state-backed effectiveness. Now, that she so convincingly discusses this question of affect, for me, opens a bit of a conundrum. And I suspect this is one of her aims in the book. So affective justice argues that affect is produced and manipulated through political rhetoric, through social media, through various kinds of campaigns of persuasion, all of which draw on and leverage shared sensibilities. And again, I find her rhetorical analysis at many different scales or levels to be very convincing, right? That she really shows in this book how it is that certain kinds of campaigns, political speeches, and so on produce an affective sense, but also by drawing on shared sensibilities that I think pre-exist these interventions. So one consequence of this is that the bedrock of non-state legal authority in some ways relies on producing a kind of correspondence between the addressee's sense of justice and that which the court or the politician offers in the name of justice, right? And so the conundrum, it seems to me, is that the diagnosis of whether justice is being offered then depends in part on the audience, right? Depends on the frame of reference. And what that means is, in the concrete terms of the book, the ICC is just and unjust, or just or unjust, right? Impunity is the right response or not the right response, depending in part on the audience of address. And I think this is an important conundrum to open up, especially for anthropologists of law, because it pushes us to recognize and grapple with how a single institution can be simultaneously legible through two distinct grammars of concepts, or maybe you want to say grammars of justice. And if we take this seriously, then I think we cannot avoid asking about the role of power. So these are not simply two different interpretations by two differently positioned parties. These are, and Clarke shows this so well in the book, these are two ways of being and of understanding law, and even more importantly, justice in lived relations of colonial power, or lived colonial relations of power, to put it perhaps better. And so actually, I wanted here to invoke the words of one of our other blog writers who is unfortunately not here, and that's Sarah Kendall, because she draws in her blog post a kind of comparison between a US example and some of Clarke's examples. And what she writes is that these claims to justice are located within different historical contexts that make them resonate in distinct ways with their intended audiences, engaging different embodied affects and emotional regimes, to use Clarke's terms, whether as anti-colonial sentiments born out of a history of violent colonial governance and possession, or through mobilizing settler colonial narratives of possession and libertarian distrust of institutions. And I think what Kendall actually really is able to bring out here is the way that Professor Clarke's book really pushes us to reckon with this question of justice as also a question of audience undergirded by those of power, right? So the last point I wanted to make in my last few minutes here is about scale. And this is a point that I think is another of the hugely important contributions that Professor Clarke's book makes to anthropology. So Clarke has shown that a legal process is affectively powerful when it addresses, not just, and this is an example from the conclusion of the book, not just theft and violence, but the larger conditions within which theft and violence happen. Justice, as I read Clarke's intervention, requires a procedure for addressing sedimented histories of structural inequality and violence. And in turning to the African court in the second half of the book, Clarke suggests that in as much as African countries, in spite of all of their differences, share a history of colonialism and a lived knowledge of enduring colonial relations of power, a court on the continent of Africa can perhaps be more effective at securing justice than an ICC or the ICC. Now, this intervention, I think, opens but does not fully answer, as I think the best books do, a question I would really love to pursue further. And that is, does this mean that all justice is local, or that the most effective justice is local? And if that's one of the things we take, this sort of question of scale, then what are the characteristics of the local? And is this about a shared set of sensibilities and histories? Is it a matter of geographical or territorial location, something I think Professor Clarke would probably resist? And within what conditions does locality serve or fail to serve justice? And I think that these really important questions, or for me at least, this important question of scale, again, both gets to the heart of what a study like this can offer, precisely because of its incredible scope, but also because it really, in providing a kind of comparison between the ICC and the African court, invites us to think about what are the parameters and procedures within which law's justice could be transformed into justice in the kind of more substantive sense of undermining unequal relations of power. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Clarke, for this book.
And thank you, Professor Lemons. That's fantastic. So this kind of initial volley of scale and its potential impacts and questions about the book. Now we are happy to have Professor Grovogui from Cornell University.
Sorry, I hadn't realized I was muted. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, thank you very much. Like the previous speaker, I was really impressed by the final outcome of this book. I had seen multiple versions of it being circulated in many places. And I really, really think that this book is as good, even if not even better than Fiction of Justice, in terms of the kind of stuff it opens up for all of us to think about. I'm just going to make a few comments here, and then as an introduction, I want to go. As I was reading the book, at some point I stopped and I counted how many times emotive was used as opposed to emotional. And I thought I should count them because the book is called Affective Justice. Emotive is usually used in relation to intense feelings, right? And the manner in which you use emotive aligns actually with affect, because the feelings of caring emerges from when, right, something else prompts the reaction. Emotional align with affectation for the following reason. Emotion means that the state in which one was already formed prior to the encounter of the thing. And in that way, affectation, which means, right, that a state that is divorced from even that prior encounter is used to suggest an encounter prior to that encounter. I don't know, I'm blabbling. I missed that. I missed something somewhere. But anyway, what I wanted to say that the way we think about emotive and emotional is that emotive aligns with affect, emotional aligns with affectation. And I was puzzled by why emotional was being used as opposed to emotive. And the reason that I was puzzled, and I actually find my answer later because it was beautifully answered, and that's what I want. So it's not a critique, it's actually a little trick that was played on me reading the book. I was a bit nervous because there's that old canard in European jurisprudence that and political thought that imagine that in the West, the cogito canalizes passion. And it is for this reason that the West can self-adjudicate, it can judge itself, right? And you see that in the ICC, in the Treaty of Rome. We assume that in the West, people can judge themselves, which is totally false. It does not correspond to any kind of reality. But we assume that elsewhere, outside of the West, that passion dispenses with reason. And because of that, we actually need intervention. And that is usually how it's presented. And so as I was thinking about that, I said to myself, why would you want them to present African reaction as emotional? And I realized that we're not talking here, we're talking about an affective disposition, but of course, the sentiment lingers. It's prior to, which is not a bad thing, because prior to the ICC, we actually had the League of Nations. The League of Nations also had its own system of justice, and I'm going back to colonialism, which is actually why I thought that Kamari did a beautiful thing playing with my own emotions as I was reading the book, and only to find out that, in fact, we are talking about something that exists prior to this moment. So being emotional may not be a bad thing in that respect. It is in the context of the ICC that Lord Heward CJ reiterated with respect to justice, again, among colonial population, the idea that justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done, right? Which means that justice actually was never something concrete, and it belies the positivist claim that there is something called effective justice that is material and you can give. Of course, we know today that all questions about restorative justice, remedial justice, and all those, they always fell short. What matters is that people perceive what is being done as corresponding to something. And that to which it corresponds is not actually material. It has to have an affective content, which is that I have to be convinced that what is done is not only different from what has done before, but it corresponds in a current state of consciousness to what can be envisaged in the future. And in that way, obviously, justice must be seen to be done. It's not just that it is done. And so, and this was said in 1923, and now we are back to the same point where somebody imagines that justice obviously is something we create over there, international justice, and we have domestic justice. And so that also connects slightly to the idea of scale, because we actually have no problem imagining that our rules of justice here in the West, however localized they are, can be scaled up to correspond to justice everywhere else, to satisfy the needs of justice for people elsewhere. And of course, the emotive reaction that we have to that response suggests that we actually have in our minds in Africa, now I'm talking about in Africa at a certain age, to what justice ought to be. And what justice ought to be is not just that people are punishing victims, and I'm actually very glad about how Kamari started out with the question of justice of victims and victimized and etc. Sorry, somebody was calling me, I don't know why. But that one actually has to see, even in relation to what was done in the past, what we have today, right? The idea of universal justice, dispensing with universal justice, was very emotive. That is actually, in many ways, for many people in Africa, including myself, the first point at which I decided that I probably don't want to have anything to do with international justice. The Issa Abre and the former Israeli Prime Minister, Sharon, right? They decided that Sharon is the head of a democratic country, and which means which is an old parallel between white and black and etc. And Issa Abre is an African. So Belgium decides that they don't need universal justice. They actually need to have a much more tailored justice. The whole idea of universal justice was vacated before. And that for many people in Africa was actually the primary core, right? That was very, very important. The other one was, and I'm going to finish here, the other one was obviously the idea of the responsibilities given to individuals who nobody could vouch, could not be subjected to international pressure, under international pressure. And of course, we see that in the corresponding ideas of proprio motu, where the prosecutor can make their own determination about what to pursue. We see that in the kind of immunities and privileges we give certain heads of state. We give that to, in the idea, in the manner in which immunities and privileges in the world in relation to international justice seem to correspond to race and location. That we actually implicitly assume that if Sarkozy were to do something, we shouldn't really look carefully because there probably ought to be a reason there. If the president of Guinea does something, of course, there has to be something untoward, right? Which now, in my last comment, has to come to the idea, to the very funding idea of international justice and around the question of genocide and crimes against humanity. The author of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide, Raphael Lemkin, had determined what today qualifies for crimes against humanity and genocide. But the description itself was telling, because there were, in his mind, acts against the physical nature of groups. And then there were acts against the cultural aspect of groups, which means that you can eliminate people physically and they disappear, or you can actually destroy them through the destruction of their culture, etc. But how did he call them? The first set of acts against the nature of physical nature of groups were called acts of barbarity. Of course, the coast of Barbary, you know where that is. And the second one was acts of vandals, which means that the crimes that were being committed in Europe itself, the pogroms and later the Holocaust, could not be characterized by attribute that one can attribute to Europeans. It has to come from somewhere else. It has to be either the vandals over there or then barbarians on the Mediterranean coast of Africa. Which means that people, and this is why I actually think that Kamari has opened a kind of worm here, because you can actually take these arguments and carry them forward. There is a reason why people react emotionally, but the emotive content of the emotional actually comes not only from that history, but it's palpable, it's material. It has to do with the way in which justice appears to be done today, which corresponds exactly, yes, 1 minute, which corresponds exactly to how it was done before. And that, obviously, as an African, I cannot tolerate. Either we have universal justice, universal jurisdiction, or we don't. And if I have to choose between universal justice and national justice, however, if people relinquish universal justice, I must choose national and continental justice, however imperfect that might be. But at least I can build the jurisprudence of my own. I can go toward finding out how we punish crimes where I come from. But we cannot have it both ways. Universal justice, universal jurisdiction, and we figure out a jurisprudence that corresponds to that, or we go for localized continental. Because that fiction that Europe can judge itself is utterly false. Nobody ever pays for the crimes of Sétif, for Charon, for none of them. Even the crimes committed in Iraq, we don't even pay attention to it. Trump just pardoned one of those guys. General Kelly from Vietnam only spent 3 months in jail. You can't tell me that there's some mechanism in the West. What we know about the human, one last minute, what we know about the human is that with regard to crimes of war and certain crimes against humanity, national passions prevent any leader in any country, no matter what its institutions, its democratic systems, from actually enacting justice against its own. We either have universal justice to take care of those, or we go back to Africa. I stop there, thanks.
Powerful, powerful provocation. Thank you so much. Continuing with the themes of scale and affect, and also location. Building on this, Professor Wamai, please. And I believe you're still muted.
I have
Perfect. Thank you.
unmuted myself. So thank you very much, Kevin. I want to join everybody else in congratulating Professor Kamari Clarke for this really insightful and detailed book. I think I met Professor when she was still writing the book, and I remember she came to Cambridge to present about Bring Back the Girls. And that's the first time I heard the bring Back the Girls. You remember when Boko Haram had captured the young women? And this was the first time I heard about the concept of affective justice. That's the first time I heard from her. And it struck me, and I remember all of us in the room were quite struck in how she thought about affective justice and with regards to Bring Back the Girls. And it's interesting to see this concept now. Of course, and even then she was talking about international justice, but justice and the narratives that came around bringing back the girls. And you've seen there's a chapter in the book on the same. And so thinking through that, and also my own work, I found I saw a lot of resonance then, because I wrote my PhD on the politics of the ICC intervention in Kenya in 2016. My own research focused on the liberal unpacking why was the ICC failing, because by the time I started the research, it was in 2013, 2014, the ICC trials on Kenya were ongoing. So it was a very heated, very interesting time to be doing my fieldwork. And so it was interesting to see how eventually in 2016, the same court cases collapsed in Kenya. And also it challenged my own thinking, because I'd been working with civil society in Kenya. Also at that time, I was in Cambridge. And so my outlook also was, justice will be done by the ICC. And actually when the election in 2013, when Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, the current president and deputy, won the election in 2013, I was also among my colleagues in Cambridge and many other colleagues in civil society were wondering how can the criminals, these people who've been indicted as criminals by the International Criminal Court, win an election. But later on, of course, as at the time when I started doing my research, and I think even by then, it's when I had encountered Professor Kamari Clarke and her ideas of affective justice. And then after maybe a year, again, doing anthropological research among people, victims, especially affected by the violence, it is when I started challenging also and started thinking why then the ICC was failing, and seeing the value of Kamari Clarke's ideas on affective justice. So I realized that I was also assuming and speaking the same language of affect that Kamari talks about when we say, all these are criminals indicted by the International Criminal Court. And when you get to the ground and live with people and do research among them, you find their situated practices of justice. And I found they differed. Sometimes they agreed with the International Criminal Court on certain things, but most of the times they differed because their situated realities and their ideas of justice were often different from how the ICC saw itself and how it saw its promise of legal justice compared to these situated practices of justice that many of the victims that the ICC was speaking for differed with the ICC. So I believed in that promise of justice before that from the ICC prosecutors that it undertook for the victims. But a few months into my research, using anthropological methods that focused on the same victims, it changed my worldview about the ICC's liberal ideas. After realizing and also seeing the everyday realities and the situated practices and needs of those that the ICC was speaking for, so justice needs. So I started to understand why the ICC liberal justice could not fully deliver the kind of justice needed by the victims in the short and medium term. It was clear that beyond the politics of the day, in Kenya, of course, you know that the president and the deputy were indicted. So they, of course, it was a fait accompli largely also for the ICC, because they did not support also the process of the ICC, and largely because of I like how Kamari describes this, the politics of the affective justice. So because then it became a very emotional space, and people would be not just those indicted, the president and the deputy and the other elites indicted, but also those from their ethnic groups who did not see them as criminals, as the ICC narrative sold them as, but saw them as their saviors, saw them as the people who protected them. So these differing narratives of justice and also performances of injustice, as another scholar has argued, largely also led to the failure of the ICC in Kenya, and its failure to recognize also the historical and the moral economy around which the ICC, that the victims operate at the everyday level, and how that moral economy is also connected to reciprocity, especially in African setups, and all this is about culture and how that links to the history also of the country, the history of our politics. So just that failure to acknowledge these situated practices, situated histories by the ICC led to what now I would call Kamari Clarke's ideas of affective justice, because then discourses, those are the discourses that emerged of injustice against us from the colonial times to the now, by, the imperial injustice. And so the ICC then, of course, in Kenya, by 2016, it exited unceremoniously, having failed to prosecute, not to prosecute the cases before the court. Methodologically, this work also was also very important to my own work, maybe your earlier work, because that's the one I drew a lot of. I learned a lot from the fictions of justice, especially how we need to think about an anthropology of international justice, and that's what my work does. So fictions of justice was also very important in inspiring me and also showing me ways that you can think of researching international justice beyond the dominant ways that, of course, international justice is thought of. And this work goes further and even presents this multi-scalar approach, which again has been a lot of learning for me. So affective justice brings also the focus of the hierarchies of violence. It focuses on the hierarchies of what violence require interventionism, and I will not delve much in that. Professor Siba has talked about it. Why is it that the racialized violence in the US right now with the Black Lives Matter is seen as a lesser evil and not requiring international intervention compared to violence resulting from internal governance challenges in many of these African countries, of course, simply often just labeled as ethnic conflict. And this is hypocritical. And so in conclusion, I agree with Professor Kamari Clarke on the need for an anthropology of international justice, as opposed to assuming a universalized idea of justice like Rawls and others had argued for, and for localized forms of justice that respond to the situated realities of communities. Eurocentric justice imaginaries need to be provincialized to the province of Europe they belong to, as argued by Dipesh Chakrabarti. And affective justice provides us a concept and as a lens to actually situate these practices and situate these tensions. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. So it's the conversation is absolutely building in terms of this focus on, again, scale, place, location, And Professor Krever, please, can you continue?
Thanks, Kevin. So thank you, Professor Clarke, for writing this really rich book that I think is very welcome, especially given well, the banalities and liberal pieties that so dominate most writing on international criminal law and the ICC in particular. So Professor Clarke begins her book with some anecdotes that draw out some of the different types of discourses and narratives that surround international criminal justice. And I thought I would also begin with an anecdote. Hopefully it doesn't take up my full 8 minutes. Reading Professor Clarke's book, I was reminded of a conference I attended in Liverpool about 8 years ago. It was in fact where I first met, amongst others, Christopher, one of our other panelists. And the conference's focus was on critical approaches to international law. So I was also reminded of how over the course of 2 days of this conference, 2 implicit camps formed, each to analogize with Kamari's, Professor Clarke's preface, with its own discourse or style in which it talked about international justice. So one camp seemed to understand critique with identifying problems with international criminal law and its institutions and proposing ways to improve their operation, right? If only we had a more competent administration of international criminal law, if only there was better cooperation between states parties, if only the prosecutor would target X actor or X crime. If only him at the time, less incompetent, more efficient, etc. Right? International criminal law and the ICC had their problems, to be sure, but if we could identify their shortcomings, we could improve them and we could help them fulfill their true potential. Now, the other camp at Liverpool was concerned with a quite different sense of critique. Durch bewaffnete Kritik können Staaten zerschmettert werden, as Brecht wrote of the power of critique. Critique has the power to smash states. In fact, implicit in this camp's interventions, of which I was a part, was a critique not only of international criminal law, but of the reformists in this first camp, right? In treating international criminal law as an otherwise efficacious response to the violence of the present conjuncture, but for some imperfect legalistic procedures or but for some prosecutorial incompetence, this more radical position held, we would not only continue to elide deeper problems, but also continue a process of ideological mystification, right? It was at best short-sighted and at worst complicitly obfuscatory. So this implicit division at Liverpool bubbled through explicitly only the one time, when a speaker on the conference's closing panel addressed the more radical critics in the room. We had different approaches, she acknowledged, but ultimately, she insisted, we were all interested in the same thing. International criminal law, she said, was like the emperor in Hans Christian Andersen's tale. Right? Its ideologues refused to recognize his nakedness, but us critics, like the child of Andersen's tale, recognized the emperor's nudity for what it was. Now, our council might take different shapes, but ultimately we all wanted the same thing, to dress the emperor. We all wanted to make international criminal justice work better. Now, the analogy struck me then, as it does now, as entirely inapposite. No, I wanted to intervene, and perhaps the chair wisely didn't take questions. No, I wanted to shout. We're not all interested in a resplendent emperor. You know, while some critics wanted to help dress the emperor, others are asking why the fuck would we want to have an unelected hereditary monarch at all? And surely there were better ways to social organization that didn't perpetuate feudal relations of domination. So Professor Clarke's book, I'm certain, would have infuriated the reformists in the room. Her book demands that we move beyond the pieties of liberal legalism and interrogate not only the explicit politics of international criminal law or the International Criminal Court, but also the ways in which their politics are more subtly shaped by multiple assemblages, including the very discourses advanced by both critics and defenders. Right? When Moreno Ocampo or Bensouda declare or declared that all they're doing is applying the law, nothing else, this isn't a neutral statement. It's part of and contributes to the particular narratives of justice and the role of law specifically in those ideas of justice and the social imaginaries of justice that get made and remade in and around the court. Professor Clarke's analysis helps us see, I think, that the reformist critics of the court are just as much involved in processes of legal encapsulation, to use her term, as the apologists. So international criminal law is not neutral, and nor is the terrain on which it's interpreted, imagined, legitimized, deployed. The book, in short, I think is such a vital intervention, moving the analysis away from these banal debates that dominate discussions of international criminal law and the ICC onto more sort of furtive critical terrain. Professor Clarke's book also forces us to think carefully about the law more generally, I think, in social and political movements. Her focus is on the emergence of an anti-impunity movement, for example, and the centering of liberal legalism in international justice discourses. But she provides, I think, also more insights more generally into the juridification and judicialization of politics. But here, I guess I wanted to know in reading the book, how she understands the processes she describes to fit into sort of broader secular trends in the longue durée. She writes of the longue durée of structural violence, but there's also a longue durée of the juridification of politics, right? Especially the politics of resistance to war, to imperialism, to injustice. That is marked, I think, by a recent acceleration in particular in the post-Cold War era. So why is it that justice has come to be synonymous with law? That wasn't always the case. Is it simply the contingencies of emotion and affect, or is there some underlying systemic logic that can explain this, that explains the emergence of a particular affective justice at this precise conjuncture? We can think back to when Vietnamese peasants were dying at the hands of US imperialism, and anti-war protesters expressed their moral and strategic opposition to the war, denouncing it as immoral, imperialist, wasteful even. But rarely did they seek to characterize that opposition in terms of the war's legality or the criminal liability of American leaders and strategic planners. Now, in sharp contrast, we can look at when the US prepared to invade Iraq in 2003, the legality and international law were very quickly cemented as the dominant frame configuring public debates about the war, especially within the anti-war movement. Right? So during both the lead up and aftermath of the invasion, much popular opposition to the war was framed in the language of legal argument. The war was an illegal use of force, including the language of international criminal justice, or precisely international criminal law. Right? The war was the work of war criminals, and as such, George Bush, Tony Blair, and so on should be tried in The Hague. So the emergence of the anti-impunity movement since the end of the Cold War that Professor Clarke describes, I think can be understood as part of this same trend. But so too, the Pan-African backlash against the ICC, which is actually, we see, no less legalistic in its alternative, right? An African court that, despite a broader understanding of victimhood or culpability, still shares a faith in the power of international law. Now, we can understand why even a nominally anti-imperial Pan-Africanism might embrace law and even liberal legalism, although I would have liked to read more of that story in the book, right? Part of that story, I think, has to be the defeat of anti-imperialist struggles, the collapse of the Third World movement, the decline of the workers' movements in the metropole, the latter's commitment to a radical internationalism giving way to more parochial concerns. And so basically, little remains of the mass anti-imperialist movements of the 60s and early 70s, uniting and mobilizing activists and revolutionary masses in metropolitan core and periphery alike. And political mobilization increasingly depends, as Robert Knox has written, on appeals to the depoliticized masses of late capitalist society who don't necessarily have any principled commitment to anti-imperialism, and which are thus made in the language of language not of anti-imperialism, but in the language of legality and international law, this depoliticized language. So by the start of this century, right, the language of international law, and in particular human rights, had basically entirely displaced anti-imperialism as the primary emancipatory framework in the imagination of internationalism. So importantly, all this is not without consequence, right? Invocations of law are inevitably depoliticizing, I would argue they undermine other extra legal practices of resistance, and I've said more about this and why elsewhere. I won't repeat it here. And I suspect maybe that here's where Professor Clarke and I perhaps depart, right? Where I think I'm much less optimistic about the types of critiques of the ICC that, even in invoking the language of anti-colonialism, such as the Pan-African critiques she describes, ultimately still want to dress the emperor, or at least replace him with institutions still clad in the garbs of international law. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. We have, I believe, two more panelists to hear. Professor Gevers, would you like to take the mic?
Thank you so much to Kamari for having me, and to the panelists and the invitation. I must say this is a very difficult thing to do because I have so much to say about Kamari's book, and I've used Kamari's work so much. And so I thought I'd said quite a bit in the Opinion Euro Symposium, so I thought I might take a slightly different tack and think specifically about how Kamari's work relate to South Africa. Today is Heritage Day in South Africa, which is actually a repurposed holiday for Nelson Mandela. That used to be King Shaka's Day. It's now been repurposed in the name of some type of national myth of reconciliation, and I thought I might use it as a jumping off point. So one of the sharpest and earliest critiques of this myth of national reconciliation in South Africa was a literary critic called Lewis Nkosi, and he called this the Mandela Republic. And what Lewis Nkosi said is that until there was some type of economic transformation, in particular related to land, and some sense of justice, and he was a sharp critique of the TRC, that South Africa would continue to be a country whose history could only be told through the novels of Kafka. And I want to use that as a jumping off point to think through how affective justice might relate to tell the story of the recent history of South Africa and international justice and the absurdities that it's produced, and how Kamari's work really is the first time we have something like a way to understand this critically. So the descent into abyss in South African international criminal justice began right at the beginning. So when victims of apartheid abuses went to the Constitutional Court to challenge the legality of the amnesty that they were provided for international crimes, the court dismissed their challenge without ever mentioning crimes against humanity, even though the Convention Against Apartheid did little else other than define apartheid as a crime against humanity. And in doing so, the court managed to define apartheid in its opening paragraph without any reference to race. So defined apartheid as being a struggle between a minority and a majority, and without any reference to economic domination. So it was something out of perhaps Nkosi's worst nightmare. So that decision escaped, and the subsequent silence relating to the prosecution of apartheid has escaped any serious critique from what Kamari calls the international justice assemblage. Right, while South Africa have failed to prosecute its own domestic offenses and crimes committed during apartheid, we've exported a number of different international lawyers to prosecute everyone else's crimes, what Siba Njoki calls transitional justice entrepreneurs. And we've made South Africa a base for the production and for the prosecution of other people's crimes, for example, or for delivering heads of state to the ICC. So South Africa has become a sort of regional hub for prosecuting crimes in Zimbabwe, for supposedly arresting al-Bashir. And when we failed to arrest al-Bashir, a number of South African international lawyers said this is the worst thing that's ever happened in South Africa. One, in fact, said it's the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of South African law. And the whole while this has been going on, there's been a parallel movement to prosecute victims of the same families who tried to pursue justice before the Concord was shut down, have continued these cases domestically. And they've continued these cases through, with the support of the TRC commissioner, and they continue these cases through domestic prosecutions. And that entire process has also escaped the international justice assemblage, both in South Africa and abroad. And that's led to this kind of absurd situation where the victims of apartheid are relying on the grace of pro bono lawyers to help them with their claims, and the defendants who were employed by the apartheid state are having their legal fees paid for by the post-apartheid democratic state. Just one of many absurdities. This year was a particularly absurd year for international justice in South Africa. It began with F.W. de Klerk, the former apartheid president, declaring that that apartheid wasn't in fact a crime against humanity, that it was just Soviet propaganda that was meant to make South Africa look bad. And he was subsequently invited to the American Bar Association Lawyers Convention at the height of the Black Lives Matter protest to talk about racism, social change, conscience, and conviction. The TRC cases have provided some absurdities of their own. So one of the defendants in a TRC case that's ongoing has asked for a stay of prosecution for an alleged murder that he spent 50 years covering up. In another case, a family of some murdered students who have waited 40 years for justice were told that it's too soon to exhume the body. That's a premature move. But perhaps the thing that I think ties in Kamari's present and past work and captures the absurdity of South Africa's relationship to international justice is the fate of Charles Taylor's businessman friend, a certain Dutch businessman who was implicated in the crimes committed by Charles Taylor. And some of Kamari's early work spoke about the way that attribution of Charles Taylor's crimes had been racialized and disconnected from the capital flow and accumulation. So this particular Dutch businessman, in fact, is living safely in South Africa. He was convicted by a Dutch court in 2017 when he was for war crimes and for assisting Charles Taylor. When he was convicted, there was a request sent to South African authorities to arrest him. He was sentenced, I think, to 19 years in prison. And the very same international lawyers, the same international justice assemblage that convinced the court, the South African courts in 2014, they should prosecute crimes in Zimbabwe, managed to convince the magistrate that we couldn't extradite this individual to serve a sentence in Netherlands because his crimes were committed in Liberia. And we could only extradite apparently for crimes that were territorial in nature. So leaving aside the specious nature of that argument or the absurdity of the argument and what it would mean for international criminal justice if you can only ever extradite crimes when they're committed in the state concerned, what that means essentially is South Africa has become a safe haven, not only for the myriad different perpetrators of the crimes against humanity of apartheid, not only for the many benefactors of the crimes against humanity of apartheid, but even for individuals who commit crimes in other parts of the continent, European business in particular, who now have a safe haven in South Africa. And I think nothing quite demonstrates that absurdity like the idea of Charles Taylor sitting in a prison in England and a Dutch businessman who was his associate in that particular unfolding of this criminal process, living in Camps Bay, safe from extradition. So that's a lot of presaging, because what I want to suggest is that in all those absurdities, the only way to really make sense of that is through Kamari's work. So nothing allows us to get to the bottom, I think, of precisely how the overwhelming silence, absence of prosecution and the overwhelming silence for apartheid and the prosecution of apartheid, both in South Africa and internationally, other than precisely what Kamari calls, the legal technocratic processes, the embodied affects, and the emotional regimes. It's only that understanding of justice as affected, as racialized, as historical, as separate as justice as practice can really explain the absurdity of the situation in South Africa and begin to allow us to think about how we might understand what South Africa might tell us about how international criminal law generally provides immunity for global white supremacy and Western violence. And in particular, in two ways, and I'll end with this. So the first is Cedric Robinson's critique of the TRC was in his interlocutor was in Kafka, it was Umberto Eco, was that the TRC produced a closed text. So what the TRC produced was a text in which apartheid was unique, localized, aberrant phenomenon. It wasn't the continuation of the West. It wasn't a Western thing the way Derrida said apartheid was a Western thing. It was a unique, specific domestic problem. And the miracle of South Africa forgave not just white South Africans like me, but the West as a whole for all their crimes. Right? And I think it's very important to think about how Kamari's work, through its different spatializations, unpacks some of those domestication in very deliberate and literal sense of apartheid. The second way is that if apartheid was, as Derrida said, racism's last word, it set the stage for the rearticulation of global white supremacy in South Africa and around the world, in part through the liberal enfeebled approach and the pieties, liberal pieties that Tor mentioned of international criminal law. And Lewis Nkosi said that the TRC was at the center, what he said, the shifting physiognomy of white power that allowed the maintenance of white supremacy, but with the mirage of reconciliation. I think Kamari's work calls on us to think about how through these effective regimes, through legal technocratic processes, the ICC allows us to do the same thing in respect of the West. Right? Complex ways of understanding complete immunity for Western crimes, as Siba has pointed out, but through various ways of displacing responsibility. And I think what it does is it places affect at the center of that critique. And I think it's an absolutely wonderful book. It's been so generative, as all Kamari's work has been for my work. And I look forward to reading it and engaging. Thank you so much.
Great, and thank you. Professor Mookherjee, please.
Thank you so much, Kamari, for having me. And this is a fantastic way to continue the conversations. I met Kamari, I think a year ago, was it? And then the book came along, and then following the book, we've also had a chance to kind of continue our collaboration more in thinking about reconciliation. So this is a wider conversation that I'm really happy and glad to be part of. As I speak, just about only yesterday, the British Parliament has been debating about the Overseas Operations Bill, which is a bill which looks like it'll get passed, and it proposes a presumption against prosecution after 5 years for British soldiers serving overseas, and it has been seen to be a way to decriminalize torture. And I just came across the news while we were on this webinar that the Labour Party has sacked 5 of its backbenchers who decided to refute the whip and vote against the bill. The bill might face more opposition in the House of Lords, but kind of reflection on the bill, it's kind of makes me reflect even more on what affective justice is so powerfully and provocatively and ambitiously arguing. So, and in some ways, the Overseas Operations Bill is not only kind of a manifestation of, we have been talking about liberal piety, but it's actually kind of a flexing of muscle of saying that, you know, justice for some and injustice for the others. It's a really poignant and subsequent illustration to bring along in discussing this book. In reading Kamari's book, for me, it materialized Mudimbe's famous dictum of the idea of Africa needing legal solutions to political solutions itself. And her idea of affective justice, primarily of the deployment of embodied affects, emotional regimes, and technocratic forms of knowledge in a mode of embodied and regimented practice, was a very resonant to me. And it also, for me, pointed out the role of law as affect. So I want to talk about 3 things in this part of my contribution. One, of the role of law as affect and law as violence. Also, ways in which we need to theorize affect. What are the kind of pros and cons of the way in which affect has been theorized? And also the role of ICC and racism and its link to geopolitics in relation to my own work and research in Bangladesh itself. In thinking about law as affect, Kamari's book and the role of affective justice really reminded me of the late 1980s in India when I was a high school student, of the affective potentialities of the story of a young girl's struggle to be a law enforcer. She was planning to be the police. I have no time for the police right now, but you know, it was a kind of a television serial with this emotional opening tunes, which precisely viscerally brought in what Kamari talks about. The law's possibilities can be found in emotional aspirations for social change. And this embodiment of the affects of justice also deems to make it mobile, universal, aspirational. And as we see in the book, it is it's a kind of a tour de force of the way it turns into legal morphings, protests, contestations among multiple sets of lawyers, civil society actors, survivors in multiple contexts, configurations, and publics. What struck me in the book, in thinking of law as violence, was the very fact that the ratification of the Rome Statute is that the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, in bringing in very structural adjustment proposals, were also including the ratification of Rome Statute as a condition. That was really new to me. And it kind of brought in Benjamin's theorization of violence, of that force is essentially implied in the very concept of justice as law, as Droit, as Derrida has elaborated. Here, it also shows the role of victim fetish is also something worth thinking about, to see how to implement the anti-impunity formulations that do so in the name of protecting the judicialized victims. The latter often being the disembodied, mediated hashtag phenomena like Bring Back Girls and Bring Back Our Girls, and in some ways it is a darker side of affect, where affect is identified with the attachments we have to it, the way we feel, like the stirring music I was talking about as a young girl, and also the indifference and the boredom that affect brings. You know, you hashtagged it, we can move on. So it has both those 2 sides in terms of thinking about justice. And the conjuring of the victims is also undertaken by those deemed to be the perpetrators in Kamari's book, who seek to reject seemingly the juridical claims of the ICC as a new form of colonialism. And as she rightly shows, the prevalence of arrests of African male perpetrators in the ICC, and is also perceived to shield the West and pursue the West itself. This brings to light also the under-resolved processes of colonialism and its conjoined extraction and the plunder of African resources, as Kamari shows. And these powers again making decisions to try corrupt African leaders through these unequal juridical frameworks, where no corrupt leaders of global north have been tried in spite of massive legal transgressions. And as we see, a law is being passed in the current British Parliament to absolve soldiers who have carried out torture. Second point, in terms of turning to how to theorize affect. We are obviously very struck by affect and the turn to emotion senses. It has hinted at how there's a certain public waiting there, which is imbued with affect in response to various objects and figures. But it's a straightforwardly productive affect, always felt, manifested. Elsewhere, I've argued in a piece called Aesthetics of Nations, that while drawing from the anthropology phenomenology, it's the self-presence of a certain kind of pre-given phenomenology of things as they are, devoid of politics and history, that we need to avoid when theorizing affect. To theorize affect as only a personal, corporeal, and sensuous occurrence fails to identify how certain images become affective intensive in the first place. In fact, the affective responses to the victim fetish that Kamari shows cannot be understood only through visceral and embodied perception. And I draw on Sarah Ahmed's words, who says how the feelings feel in the first place may be tied to a past history of readings, in the sense that the process of recognition of this feeling or that feeling is bound up with what we already know. Affective justice powerfully and precisely locates these circuits in the historical and political context. The affective victim rhetoric undertaken by the persecuted erstwhile anti-colonial freedom fighters also creates its own publics in the African subcontinent through the narratives of the unresolved legacies of colonialism and past genocides. Such creation and recognition of feelings based on unresolved histories of unacknowledged genocides, past colonialisms, can be also found in the case, in my case, in the controversial and internationally criticized Bangladesh War Crimes Tribunal, which has been prosecuting and executing its domestic collaborators, local collaborators who kind of signed up with the West Pakistani Army to carry out rape and killings of massive scales. This tribunal was set up in 2009 by the current left liberal, deemingly left liberal government in power right now, which is carrying out in its third term a kind of completely unopposed election, because there was no opposition party to prevalent, disappeared. So it was a kind of unhindered election of his third term, and it's led by a woman. And this tribunal, it's a national tribunal within Bangladesh itself, was constituted under the International Criminal Crimes Tribunal's ICT Act of 1973, was formulated in Bangladesh in 1973 and amended in 2009. And as a result, Bangladesh avoided taking the tribunal to ICC. And this is where I find kind of very interesting parallels with Kamari's work and what is happening in the African subcontinent, because in some ways, Bangladesh avoided taking it to ICC, precisely knowing that the entire Bangladesh war was caught up within a geopolitics of the Cold War, where it's never been recognized as a genocide within the international framework itself. And so after nearly 40 years of Bangladeshi independence, and actually next year it'll be the 50th year, this national tribunal charged 17 individuals and has also executed a large number of people using the death penalty in a way to address and resolve and sort out its issue, because it would otherwise see that that issue would never be addressed. So in some, and this is where it has been hugely criticized, but Bangladesh has been very explicit in calling for the fact that they don't want to go to the ICC because they don't see that justice will be on their side. So while I was thinking about this, the very reading Affective Justice really kind of brought to me the complexity of it. So rather than and in bringing out as someone who opposes the death penalty, I've also need to understand what my very left liberal friends in Bangladesh, why they would support the death penalty as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist. That doesn't make me an apologist. It was something that has been brought in against Kamari's book. She is trying to bring out the complexity of the various ways in which the various African countries feel against the ICC and the recourses they are taking to kind of shield themselves from what they see as an unequal justice system against them. And I would talk about this more in terms of the question of authoritarian victimhood later on, but maybe that is something Kamari could reflect on, because that is another parallel I find with my own work in Bangladesh, as well as with Kamari's work, Kamari's various cases itself. So what happens when the victim themselves become authoritarian, as has been the case within Bangladesh itself? I'll stop there. Thanks very much for a fantastic, provocative book, which I have hugely enjoyed engaging with. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Mookherjee. And thank you to all of our panelists for such a generous engagement. I mean, generous in the sense of the depth of your reading and provocations, though there were several kind of opportunities for Professor Clarke to kind of respond and develop. Professor Clarke, what did you, I mean, this is now the invitation for you to respond. What did you hear?
Okay, well, thank you, of course, Kevin, and to Audrey, which I think we'll hear more from Audrey and Macklin in the second half after my comments. But thank you to you both for your role in hosting this and co-hosting, and to Sarah Ali and to Kate, of course, for helping with the tech and what have you. And of course, thanks to all of you, the panelists, every one of you, for being willing to read the work, for those who commented on Opinion Juris, as well as being called on again to engage with us here as a follow-up. So I only have about 10 minutes, so I guess 10 to 20 minutes. So I'll try to make this brief and interesting. And in part, I'll say a little about what I intended in the writing of the book, and then in doing that, I'll pick on a number of points that were raised and questions, and perhaps even bring out some of the tensions where I continue to disagree with some of my colleagues, or at least maybe not disagree, but where the point of tension is and what's at stake for me and what's at stake for them. And in particular, I'm thinking of Tor's comments, and maybe it's not necessarily as much a disagreement as it is a matter of emphasis, but I'll get to that in a moment. And to all of you, thank you, and of course Katherine again, those who Katherine and Nayanika and Christopher, who both already presented material at the Opinion Juris panel. So where to start? Well, no better place than in this moment. So in North America, especially in the U.S., the issues and calls for justice couldn't be louder. With the Breonna Taylor verdict, or at least the verdict around the police officer who killed her, I think it's certainly a moment in which Black and Brown and Indigenous people continue to feel dispensable. And at the heart of that is certainly an embodied response, which the book attempts to address. But what the book also addresses by way of thinking about racism and racialization is that it is no accident that these are the responses that we're getting from the Black Lives Matter movement, or particular movements on the African continent and Latin America and elsewhere, in which people are calling for attention to structural injustice. So attention that when we think about justice, that we actually talk about the conditions of inequality, which are political, which are economic, which have to do with the longue durée of empire and imperialism in these regions, the nature of extraction in these regions and in our world around us. In the Canadian context, the politics around the pipeline that First Nations and allies are engaged in. And so the list goes on. And one thing that's clear in this moment is that there are limits to the law. It's not simply that that the book and that the issues here aren't that we throw away the baby with the bathwater, that we don't need law at all. That's not at all the point, but that there's a recognition what this moment is continuing to make bare, as it has in the past, is that there are limits to the law, and that there's a historicity connected to the law, that the same international law that was used to indict Charles Taylor and to indict other African leaders is the same international law that was used to justify transatlantic slavery, that was used to justify imperial conquests of land, the scramble for Africa and the demarcation of land and the division of land, that it's the honing and the technocratic maneuvering of these instruments of the law that are part of the problem. And in many ways, what the book attempts to do by looking at a liberal, an internationalist liberalist movement that sees itself as colorblind and that sees itself as having answers for dealing with some of the worst crimes against humanity, what we see is that law constantly falls short on many levels. It is bare. The empire has no clothes. The reality that the U.S. now, that these questions of the selectivity of the law are bare around the Israel-Palestine question, around the U.S., and around the preponderance of cases. All of the cases before the International Criminal Court have been cases involving Africans, African leaders, those that were victimized by violence on the African continent. And even though there are investigations underway, there is something about the racialized nature of the court's attention and what some of my African colleagues would say, the ICC's appetite for Africa, and often said in a joke, but perhaps the joke so that we don't cry, right? That on the public-facing side, the rhetoric makes sense, that this is about holding those accountable, holding perpetrators accountable. No one is above the law. These are things that we value, that, how can you disagree with? But in fact, the underside has imploded, and this is what the book really is about. It's about that underside and how we think about, and the analytics through which to make sense of that underside. It's also about anthropology, my frustration with anthropology, and my inability to simply use ethnographic and anthropological tools to answer some of those questions. For example, these questions of embodiment are beyond our ability to know. So someone's response, someone's feeling is not visible to us, and sometimes not even visible to others, or to those who are having those feelings in the first place. Some of those feelings pre-exist the subject. They have to do with the conditions in which they are in, the historical constraints, the color of their skin, the economic conditions, the realities of empire, once or twice removed or at their front door. And so the part of the attempt is to think about embodied affect, so to consider the pre-social and the psychosocial, but to bracket it, to recognize that what people say they feel is what we document they feel, but the knowing subject isn't fully knowable, but has to be put in tension with a number of other analytic domains. So what we can see is the materiality of these affective responses, but we also know that there exists these emotional regimes that are quite powerful. So regimes being the way that the category of the victim becomes compelling. We all want to support those who have victimized, those who have been victimized and have lost significant things. But what we can understand is the emotional regimes through which this discourse circulates. So where the international court isn't really able to prevent such violence, it's able to adjudicate after violence has happened. Part of the rhetoric is that, or the narratives that circulate, is that this court is for victims. But in many cases, some of those victims have died, or others are suffering. In what way is the court for victims? Well, it's symbolic, we're told, and the spirit is there, and the kind of liberal imaginary around which law can support us and provide a mechanism for a future tomorrow remains their intention with the actual reality of law's limits. And so emotional regimes was the other component that I wanted to tie into the third, which is these legal technocratic practices. So the biopolitics of feelings that is actually part of the structuring devices through which inequality festers. And so here, by just setting up those things, I wanted to take up some of the very thoughtful comments of my colleagues, and I'll start with Tors, since I think it's provocative in that what he has suggested is that by suggesting that the African court for these Pan-Africanists might be the solution for positioning geographies of justice within the African continent, perhaps he's suggesting that we look beyond this judicial mechanism. And this point is a quite fraught one, not on Tor's part, but it's a quite controversial one with the reading of this example in my book, because the presumption is that I'm offering the African court as an alternative because it's it's a judicialization of justice that is local. But actually what I'm trying to do by introducing the African court example is to tie in these affective regimes, the way that Pan-Africanism is called on and brought into bear with the aspiration that the worst crimes that are causing violence on the African court are not necessarily what's deemed the political crimes that are before the International Criminal Court. They actually have to do with drug trafficking and mercenarism and a range of other toxic dumping and illicit extraction of natural resources, that these are the crimes that are of concern, that are actually producing the underlying conditions that are causing the political crimes that are before the court. But those other crimes that I've just mentioned are not under the subject matter jurisdiction of the International Court. And so in part what I'm trying to do here by invoking the Pan-Africanists that are working on the implementation of an alternative juridical mechanism is to suggest the retooling of these technocratic domains, the identification of the colonial and imperial forces that have led to the rendering of secondary things like toxic dumping on the continent as something being of critical concern. And so in part I'm not suggesting that an alternative justice in Africa is the answer. It is that to understand the quest for justice is to think about the interrelationship between these technocratic tools that are being called on and built, how this is done through a particular emotive strategy, and how it feels as it's done. And so in part it's a call to reckon with these complex interrelationships. So clearly and I think that Tor's question is a good one to ask to what extent or how we can understand coloniality in this new manifestation of a court. And in fact, in the opening of the book, my tracing of structural adjustment and the production of new techniques of governance that followed African independence are a critical part of the story, that it involves the emergence of a legality that is used to sharpen the tools to manage African economies, to manage the nature of its political place in the world, that these are interrelated. And so in many ways and so I think it may be a difference in emphasis, but certainly we're on the same side there, and I look forward to continuing that trajectory of thought. We see this playing out in Christopher's comments around the absurdities of the South African case, and how South Africa has come to stand in for the extension of international justice, yet underneath, the worms underneath its very existence as a relatively new independent state is that there are unresolved sets of questions around which immunity has been rendered possible. So someone like a de Klerk, as per Christopher's point, is really an important thing, and how this alliance with de Klerk and international justice outside of South Africa continues, and what this means. And I think that there's no better example. South Africa is a wonderful one. We see it around us, what is being laid bare, and people's refusal to accept the rendition of justice that we're being told. So in other words, the emotional regime that is said to exist, that might have lured us to international justice at one time, is a regime that has its fissures and that has become bare, and that we're able to see much more clearly. Because as we know, one of the profound abilities of the law is to hide its conditions of the making, a la Michel Foucault and others who talk about those erasures that exist. So we don't see the practices of lawmaking once law becomes law, big L. What we see is its manifestation as this grandeur mechanism that can serve to protect us. But in fact, when we look back at the making of law, at the political brokering, at this wonderful point that Nayanika made about the reality that when we ask why so many African states actually even signed the Rome Statute, the reality is that in order to renew IMF loans and World Bank loans, in many ways there were conditions, and these conditionalities involved signing a range of treaties to demonstrate a commitment to good governance, to the rule of law, to all of these things that these new and fledgling states had to demonstrate. And so to think about what is law and how law exists is also to uncover those very messy contexts around which African states and other states in Latin America and elsewhere certainly exist. And so it then ties into in Njoki's point about the hierarchies of violence, and this is also a point raised by Siba, which are squarely about the nature of the political in the ways that we understand contemporary violence and the rule of law. They've both talked about double standards, the hypocritical nature of justice. And something that's curious that emerged from both of them that Katherine also raised is this question of localized justice. And in one sense, Njoki perhaps read me as, or in her work is interested in and quite committed in her activist work as with localized justice that focuses on the things that everyday people need in their locality. And then we see the same in Siba's context, in which he too talked about the importance of reckoning with African dimensions of justice, and the ways that the political nature of this institutionalization of international justice has led to inequalities through the cases of Sharon and Hissan Habre and others. And I think the point that emerges that's quite clear in both of their interventions, that's also part of Nayanika's intervention is that there's a correspondence with race and nation here. That even as law is colorblind, even as we want to believe in the objectivity of law, we also know that when we think about the cases in various places from Syria and on, there's a correspondence with race and nation. There's a correspondence with the West and the rest, and that it's that correspondence that fuels people's responses to international justice, just as they recognize that the international has its continuities from the use of international law to support slavery and violence and trafficking to the contemporary. I'll end my comments with some reflections on Katherine's. So the first is last, Katherine. Sorry, but I'll end with some reflections on some of the methodological questions and the questions of territoriality and locality that you started us off with. And like all of the other comments, I appreciated the suggestions here and also the tensions that are at play here. And part of the challenge, and I think part of the questions that those of us who are scholars, who are researchers, who collect data, who are trying to make sense of what justice is and what law is and how do we think about the interrelationship between the two, are also trying to make sense of what viable solutions are. So is the solution, does territoriality and locality matter? Or do we get rid of territoriality? Is localized justice not the answer? And what we see from, I think, a number of the comments is that we consider situated justice, and of course Katherine also highlights or touches on that as well, that territoriality or the kind of geographies of justice that presume that locality is fixed in a particular place and that doesn't recognize the circulation of these justice regimes won't really work, because the reality is that especially in the contemporary period, social media, these regimes that compel, that cut across transnational borders, become aligned with a lot of different figures, and people call on those figures in order to do the justice work that they do. It's both dangerous, compelling, and challenging to make sense of it simply in relation to locality, because it's often fraught as well. Something like a Kenyatta calling on, making the statement when he was indicted, we've seen this before, as a way to then point back to Jomo Kenyatta, his father, to simply say that what is happening to him today through an indictment of the ICC is akin to the indictment by the colonial powers, by British colonial powers. And while it works as a regime of viability that Kenyans might accept at times, or even in that 10-second moment, it might fill their bodies because they realize, yes, indeed, the British have colonized us. This is an injustice. We also know that is also, the continuity isn't really a real continuity. Yet it is in the way it feels and in maybe its technocratic nature. But there are other differences that make a difference. And so what do we do? Where do we go? Well, I think one of the things that we do is we suspend territoriality and the geographies of justice, and we consider and ponder situated justices, that we consider and ponder the processes by which we understand justice to be done. And that goes back to Siba's earlier point about the processes by which justice might be considered to be done. And that deliberative process of determining what justice is will have to involve creative, innovative, collaborative measures, not just legal measures. Perhaps at times the law can be called on to play that role. At other times we abandon those and turn to other ontological forms that enable us to think about what people value. But it's not simply local, it's not simply constituted through territorial space. And I think I went through great pains in the text to demonstrate that beyond the spatiality of justice, the circulation of these regimes, of these images, the symbols of the past, the ghosts of the past, the tormented realities of slavery that can easily get drawn into a set of narratives, are part of the art of the everyday and the communicative form that gets called on by people who we see as justice makers, who engage in justice practices. And so here, I think and I'll end by simply saying that my answer to this question about locality is that we need to take the opportunity to think about circulations in creative ways, even with the limits of research, that we need to think more creatively about what people know, how they know what they know, what images and imagery and words and histories and restrictions and economies shape those things that can form the basis of a new deliberative practice through which justice can be reimagined and remade. And so I'll end on that note, because that really is where I end in the book, in the epilogue, that justice isn't about the absence of injustice. It's about the negotiation of these mechanisms through which we understand and imagine a new world. And it's the world anew that is really on the plate at this moment, that Black Lives Matter today is about opening up the ugliness of our past and saying we won't accept this anymore, and that we have to think about a different way of reorganizing contemporary justice, and simply not through legality, because it clearly has failed us. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamari. That was a kind of forceful and comprehensive response to a remarkable range of comments. And I think I was struck also by the aspirational turn that you have made to the idea of situated justice that is both a process through deliberation, as well as, if you will, an outcome that is constantly reforming it or developing itself as situated. What I'd like to do for the next few moments that I'm going to be moderating is to remind everybody of a symposium on the international law online platform called Opinio Juris that featured a symposium on Professor Clarke's book. And some of the people here today were featured in that symposium. And what I'd like to do is ask those speakers, they are Katherine Lemons, Christopher Gevers, and Nayanika Mookherjee, to consider the following question. Can you tell us a little bit about how, if at all, the original position that you took in your commentary on in the symposium has been affected by other people's responses? And if you have anything to say about that. May I start with Professor Lemons?
Yes, hi, thank you. So I, in some ways, think that what I'm doing here is actually reflecting on perhaps a deepening of some of the questions that I had, which I think have actually also been really dealt with today in this really rich discussion. And this is the question, I think, I mean, I take it to be, perhaps it's because it's the burning question for me at the core of the book as a non-African, non-international law person, but what I take to be the burning question about the relationship between law and justice. And what I had initially written was that the epilogue, which I found to be hugely powerful, the epilogue's strong and compelling claim that justice is about addressing historical and political structures of inequality and violence, brings into relief a tension that I think justice actually introduces throughout the book. So justice is both, in the true anthropological sense, a relative concept in the sense that we are trying to understand what justice means for different constituencies, people, institutions, and a substantive one. So it is, on the one hand, what different actors say and feel it to be, but is also, and perhaps underneath this, really a matter of redressing specific injustices, and as Kamari, I think, really beautifully just said now, aspiring to something else that is more than just not injustice, right? But that moves forward. So others, including, I think, most prominently, Tor Krever has also have posed similar questions, asking sort of, can law change politics and popular affects as well? In other words, the long-standing question emerges again, does law change popular views, or does it follow from and inscribe them? And I actually want to end in some way with a recollection of a different discussion in a different context of what I think is actually at core the same very important question, which is this exchange between Judith Butler and Saba Mahmood that's published in the book Is Critique Secular? And the object that they're discussing in that particular context was the controversy around these Danish cartoons that depicted the Prophet Muhammad, and the exchange between Butler Mahmood, Talal Asad, and Wendy Brown is really about the European response, Muslim and Muslim, to the anger that some Muslims expressed about these cartoons. And the reason I sort of went back to this dialogue and thinking again about Kamari's book is that at the core, I think, of the dispute there between Mahmood and Butler, or the discussion, are questions about the usefulness of appealing, in that case, to free speech law to adjudicate the issue. And Butler there, in response to Mahmood's article, writes, does law not function on certain historical occasions to change sensibilities, to foster new parameters of equality and justice, including new sentiments? Or are we being asked to understand sentiments as definitionally extrajudicial? And in Mahmood's reply, she actually turns to the American civil rights movement as an example and says, I find it interesting to think about the relation of the sensorial and ethical actions to the more crystallized demands for legal action. What were the cultural, ethical, and sensible means by which relations were affected and transformed? And I take Mahmood's argument here to be not that legal efficacy relies on certain affective conditions, which is what Kamari's book has so forcefully shown us, but add to that perhaps, or complements that with this insight that inasmuch as law has its own genealogy, and this is also part of Kamari's work, I think, here, it cannot effect justice without a transformation in law itself, right? In other words, law itself has its own position, weight, genealogy, and then at times law is actually not the right place to seek transformation. And so after reflecting on affective justice initially, and then reading all of the wonderful blog posts and listening to this conversation, I really do think even more deeply that one of the book's most compelling invitations is to consider not only the limits of law, although I think also the limits of law, but when and how law's own sensibilities can be changed, or to raise the question of whether law's own sensibilities can be changed to better accord with the specific demands, which may be actually different demands in different contexts of post-colonial justice. So I just end by thanking you all for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Christopher Gevers, please.
Thanks, Audrey. So what to say about the responses? So I mean, I was worried when I wrote my piece that when I mentioned the idea of enfeebled legalistic accounts, that would be passe and that everything would be much more sophisticated. So one of the responses did me the favor of performing precisely the kind of account that I think Kamari's is a welcome relief from. Of the other accounts, I mean, I must admit, I was as much taken by the moment into which us having written this, these comments, this sort of moment globally into which they fit, and in particular, how it made me rethink about what Kamari just recently referred to as the circulations of ideas of justice. I realized that perhaps in my framing, I had thought about Pan-Africanism until the 60s and African states take over, and I had quite a state-based understanding of these alternative conceptions of justice. And so going back to 1968 and the protests in 1968, I'd done some work around the African diplomats in New York in 1968, but I was able, because of the moment in which we were all thinking about 1968 all of a sudden, to link up the protests in America in 1968 and the type of bold actions taken by African states in the legal committee of the UN that led to the first time apartheid was mentioned in the International Convention. So to try to link up those transnational circulations of embodied, not just justice as links between the streets of Harlem and the halls of the UN in 1968 and the actions of African diplomats, but also in terms of the conceptions of justice. So to go back to those moments and think, what would a different type of justice be that was what people were thinking in 1968 as against apartheid, and in particular the idea of justice as an antidote to domination, not just narrow, liberal, colorblind discrimination, but racial domination. And I think it was really helpful to go back both to 1968 and think about that moment and the connections that were happening in New York between states and riots on the street and protests on the street. And also to think about how that same account carries forward, right? So Sarah Kendall's approach, Sarah Kendall's comment about the reaction to the US and in particular Pompeo's speech made me think again about how the reaction to the ICC saying, even from the sort of the international justice assemblage, has been to particularize the US and the Trump administration. Right? The statement is, this is the Trump administration. It's not the US acting the way the US does. This is a particularized administration that will go away, and the liberal legal order in the West will be redeemed once more. And I was interested in thinking about how that particularization was not afforded to the African warlord, or in fact, in the case of George Clooney's outfit, the Sentinel, which is precisely defined as combating African warlords and transnational businessmen and their relationships. So the African warlord has now become a figure that is front and center of these responses. So how the particularization of the European responses or the American responses as being of particular political entities and in fact particular administrations, and then the overbroad characterization of sort of the African response as being simply an African response. And there'd be no sort of disaggregations of what that response might look like. So I found thinking about those responses in a similar way to how the ICC prosecutor, for example, said that African critiques of the ICC were like Nazis. So the Nazis, again, were particularized political projects of Europe, not Europe, but particularized projects. And the African response was an en masse African response. So those the ways that both in looking back into the past, I found sort of new ways to think about that moment, and also in the present, the kind of the complexity and the simplicity of the way that these different responses were raised, in particular the American response. I've seen a couple of the defenses of the ICC, and they tend to want to really hive off not just American power from the Trump administration, but even sanctions power from the way that it's used. The sanctions power is fine, it's just as a bad use of it. And I sort of thinking through Sarah's comments made me think a little bit more about how that particularization carries on.
Thank you. Thank you for those insights. What I'd like to do is hand it over for comment by Nayanika Mookherjee before we move on. Thanks. You might be muted. Still can't hear you.
Yeah, better.
All good.
Yeah. Along with reading the book and along with reading the commentaries, one of the kind of departures for me in this exercise of writing the commentary was, in some ways, earlier I would always think of law within its biopolitical frameworks as something which is primarily comes with its hidden violence towards us, which is still there. But at the same time, the role I value more, and I draw that from my own research, but also value more from the book and from the commentaries of the potentialities of law as well as affect. And the very fact that law provides us with a framework within which we can aspire for justice, even if that justice will never arrive, is something to be thought of in some ways. Something which brings out what Olive Zenker was also talking in his responses of the potentialities of affect itself, but also this brings out the other aspect is the dark side of affect is something worth thinking about, where we have what I was talking about earlier, the attachment to affect, as well as the disembodiedness of affect, where we can feel for something, and the legal paradigms that comes with it, but at the same time be much more disembodied about a cause. So it kind of brings in certain elements of current social activism, whether and the kind of virtual element of it, where a large part of and this is where I think Black Lives Matter is important and distinctive. It has been virtual, and it has also not been about the disembodied aspect. It has been more than that. It has been a moment which has marked something beyond the disembodiedness, and that's why it matters today in terms of what has happened and what is continuing to happen. One of the other aspects that strikes me while talking about the potentialities of affect is where there are where the role of the affective dissonance comes in. All affect is not always striking a chord, and one of the ways in which I raise this is through the figure of the idea of to go beyond the victim and perpetrator binary and think of the idea of the traitor. And what kind of emotional impossibilities, as I say, does a figure of the traitor bring in? Whether the traitor is someone who's a collaborator, or the traitor is a woman whom you suspect might have gone and slept with the enemy, and as a result, or has been sexual violence, the coercion, and the consent line is often very blurred in the way women are suspected of having gone with the enemy. So the figure of the woman as who's been subjected to sexual violence as a traitor comes up again and again within ethnographies, which is not adequately talked about. We only see the woman as victims, but actually in real life, she's often kind of brought in as someone with whom the suspicion and rumor are hinged together on her body itself. And also this goes back to the other points, I think, which we need to kind of think about much more intricately, about how today these affective justice modes have become also new tools of global control, where we think of kind of often the sexual violence and conflict has become a kind of big way of bringing various actors into justice, but at the same time we see it being applied not in a equal way. And precisely the bill with which I started with my presentation earlier on, the overseas operations bill, precisely kind of brings out maybe the role of white fragility in the midst of which we are living right now in these precarious times. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And in some ways, I want to pick up on your last comment about white fragility and just bring it back to the symposium. So the Opinio Juris Symposium, and you'll have a link to it in the chat for the YouTube video. The commentary that surrounded some of the critiques of Professor Clarke's book, and one in particular, concerned a dismissal of her work as sort of getting customary international law wrong, that kind of prioritization of a particular liberal legal version of international law, what it was about and what it could do, combined with an allegation of being a defender of impunity. And here again, we see that there's a law creates an idea of immunity, that's okay. Outside of that, it's called impunity, that's wrong. And this is all kind of a creature of law. Knowing Professor Clarke's work and her commitments, many people wrote in protest, citing this as another moment when Black scholarship is demeaned and dismissed and not taken seriously on its merits. And really what I want to do is turn it over to Professor Clarke to ask about her both response to the critique that she received and, in a sense, her response to the responses as well.
Thank you, Audrey. I'll make it very, very brief because I know we don't have much time, and my colleagues also have comments. And I'm still, I mean, basically the issues that emerged from that blog panel, the symposium, were quite interesting, and it was a context in which Richard Wilson, in his comments, not only suggested that because he disagreed with this approach to thinking about justice making, he then turned to legality, and which really and fundamentally wasn't the point of the book. The reality is that customary international law is the basis for contestation on the African continent around some of the issues that are at the heart of the book. So this is a contested site. It isn't a site in which there's simply one international law is invoked, and new possibilities are inserted into the international domain. And so, and there were a couple of two other comments that were also equally fraught. I mean, one of them was the idea that the implications of this kind of work that looks at both advocates for structural inequality and those who are anti-impunity, the implications for looking equally at these social movements is that it in some ways defends impunity. And this deserves a much longer set of discussions, but the reality is that as scholars who are interested in the global condition and who are interested in the political nature of violence, we also have to reckon with the realization that everyone has their story, whether it's Dominic Ongwen, who is now before the ICC, who was himself previously a child soldier who was drugged and made to kill, and then rose in commands and seemed to allegedly participated in significant decimation of people in Uganda. And the challenge, of course, for us in this kind of context is not just what are the political questions and the legal questions, but what are the ethical questions about how we understand justice and conditions in which a larger system of structural inequality has produced these conditions within which even those who are seen as warlords act. How do we take that up? How do we think about these questions? Do we simply dismiss? Do we understand? Do we situate it in particular ways? And so the book tries to offer a framework for thinking about those very fraught and complex set of questions. And I think a dismissal of it or the fear of impunity is not the appropriate response. So those are my general and very quick and dirty responses. I mean, I do feel that there is a racial component to it. A black woman who is basically told by a white fellow colleague that you don't know anything about this topic, a topic that I've been working on for 20 years, and isn't willing to give the benefit of the doubt and recognize that this is a contested domain, and it's important for us to explore these sites of contestation as well as the possibilities for thinking innovatively about how we take on these questions. So there's a lot there, and I think that the conversation can reverberate well beyond this forum. But thanks for bringing it up and asking, Audrey.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing those insights. And as you say, those sparks that can lead to further conversation. And indeed, one of them concerns, I think, what in the current global climate, affective justice has to offer discussions and debates about both Black Lives Matter movement and also globally and in local contexts, and also, of course, COVID-19. we don't have time to, unfortunately, ask each of the panelists to comment on that. I'm hoping that that may come out in the Q&A, which I'm now going to hand over to Kevin to moderate. And I apologize, I'm going to have to take my leave now. But I am sorry to miss what I know will be a wonderful Q&A, because there are already so many great questions already there waiting to be asked. So thank you, and I hand it over to Kevin.
Great, thank you so much. So as per the schedule,
Thank you, Audrey. Nice to meet you.
Oh yeah, see you, Audrey. We have some time remaining for the question and answer session, which I've been working through the comments on the YouTube chat function. So this is also kind of a reminder to those who are participating or attending to certainly add your questions through the chat function on YouTube. Kamari, I mean, there are a few for you, and also just for the group as well. I mean, to kind of get a sense of a larger kind of back and forth and conversation, but we of course would always want to hear from you first in this context. There are many, and we know as we become more familiar with this moderation of chats that this is an imperfect science. So for those who've submitted questions, and if I'm not doing them justice, my apologies, or if I don't get to any, my apologies as well. I wonder, Kamari, I mean, one really sticks out for me, and that's the question of critique, at least one that was mentioned in the chat. That I wonder if you could comment in relationship to the book, but also kind of returning to maybe some larger themes that you just commented on, that there's a tension between potentially like a liberal reformist sense of critique versus a more radical sense of critique in terms of the reproduction of structures of power, and how you're, I'll make this as open as possible for you as well as the group, where affective justice positions itself in relationship to what may be kind of a false binary, but two kind of extreme positions, or at least different positions. Liberalist reform, and then a very kind of radical critique of that reform and its potential to reproduce power relations.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. And very briefly, because it's a huge question, we could sit for the next 3 or 4 or 5 hours pondering this. But I mean, clearly, I'm engaged in a critique of liberal legality. So reformism isn't the answer for global violence. If we truly want to address and understand analytically the nature of violence, it means we have to then ask different questions. A question like, who killed person A, isn't the right kind of question. It's one question that's important, but it isn't. We need multiple questions that allow us to interrogate the nature of violence. What are the conditions under which this happened? Why was the policeman, in the case of something like the most recent case, why was the person in the house in the first place? What is the racialized nature of a neighborhood in which we have patrol cops in a particular area and not in other places where crime is equally thriving? And so I guess my answer would be that I am committed to a radical critique, that I think we have to ask different questions, and the questions that liberal legality offers us, who killed such and such, who killed B, or with the temporal jurisdiction being as of a certain time, when the jurisdiction is limited to, say, a 2-day period or a 5-day period, or even a 1-year period, when in fact there's the longue durée of violence, structural violence, that is part of the conditions under which inequality festers and enables violence in the first place. And so it requires a different way of thinking about justice, but the nature of the political, the nature of the social. And I know my colleagues have, there are others that probably have something to say about that as well. I'd love to hear their thoughts.
Well, that's right. I think in the last few minutes, I mean, I think affective justice provokes, as a piece of scholarship, provokes this question among many others. But it's a great moment to turn to our panelists here and hear how they build off this and how they read affective justice in relationship to this conversation.
Okay. Are you talking to us? Is that addressed to us?
Please. Yeah, absolutely. It's so hard to read on.
I just want to jump in briefly here,
sure,
if I may.
Of course, please.
Yeah. I actually don't know what liberal justice is. That is one of my problems. And so this whole idea of radical, I sometimes don't know what it is either. I had a conversation with, you all recognize, since some of you are in Canada, with Ignatieff, not the politician, but when he was the head of the Carr Center at Harvard. When during the panel, he basically said the same thing, that we're apologists. And my response to him was that there's this tension I always feel between sort of classical liberalism and the idea that stand behind them. For instance, we are all innocent until proven guilty, right? And that guilt has to be demonstrated by accusing somebody, even before you establish the guilt, that they are apologists, or that they are trying to, right? That they don't want to. Who am I going to convict? And my question there was that my comment there was that actually there is a part of liberalism I actually embrace, right? But that was not liberalism he was defending. So political liberalism, there's this jurisprudential thing that has developed in liberalism that actually is not necessarily consistent with classical liberalism in some way. And so there's an affectation that is liberal, but that is actually anti-liberal in some way, if I may say so, if it's not paradoxical, right? It's very anti-liberal. We don't know who is guilty until we establish it. The material nature of the crime itself has to be established before we establish who is innocent and who is guilty. So how could you call somebody apologist because they actually talked about establish a condition upon which that materiality is determined? It's very anti-liberal. I stop there.
Thank you.
I think there's also a history. There's a history of racialized kind of, so racial hierarchies in knowledge. And so we need also to acknowledge something that when I was in the British Academy, many people refused to acknowledge the politics of knowledge production. And so many times when the global South has to theorize something, half the time it has to be trashed as these are apologists or it's emotional. And it's really, really unfair that if people speak about their realities and if those realities deviate from this legal, for instance, in this case, legal ideas of justice, then you're labeled an apologist. But of course, I think it's because we need to also nuance our ideas, nuance our thoughts, and nuance also our ways of our ways of theorizing. And the challenge also, this nuance is only, the burden of nuancing is only given to the African or the global South, because if you look at the dominant ideas as they are, if they were nuanced, we would not be here also talking about affective justice or all these ideas that come, say, in post-colonial international relations. So also we need to acknowledge all these hierarchies of racialized knowledge that exist and really call them out when we need to.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, so I was going to just respond to what Kamari said. I really like what you said there, that law asks certain questions about, structural injustice, violence, so on, right? Who killed X person? But it can't be the only question, right? And this, I guess, my whole point is that law is not the answer here, right? It might even be part of the problem. Although we see, right, with Kevin, your colleagues over at the law school, that even, posing rather milquetoast challenges on the basis of international law can get you unhired. But there's a real, I think, I guess I would go further and be provocative to you, Kamari, and say it's not only that there's a separate question, right, that we have to ask, but that actually in asking our question, right, the legal question, and continuing to pose it, and having a powerful institution and a whole network of practitioners and scholars who continue to insist that that is the right question, right? And that by asking that question over and over again, and by using that language of law and international law, and in particular international criminal law, insisting that that can be the answer to addressing impunity, right, structural violence, that actually that it's not only that that's not sufficient, that can be actually counterproductive, right? There is that discourse about international criminal law as addressing these issues, right, as providing the answer, has an ideological effect, right? It blinkers us to actually the more substantive problems that remain. It blinds us to the shortcomings there, and actually maybe draws political energy away from those extra legal interventions that we should be making if we want to address these issues into the realm of liberal law legalism. So I would actually argue that, right, it's not just that this isn't sufficient, this is potentially actually part of or contributing to our myopia, right, and our downplaying or ignoring of the real structural problems that need to be addressed, which is why something like Black Lives Matter is so exciting, right? Because they're not they're not buying into liberal legalism. It's a final rejection of the idea that we can address institutional structural racism in the United States, but everywhere, simply by through law or the language of liberal legalism.
I'm going to come in here just to say I'm going to take leave and go to two little peoples, but I really wanted to say this has been a fantastic discussion, and thank you everyone. Thank you, Kamari, for inviting me, and thanks to Kevin and Audrey and Sarah for organizing it, and thanks for all your presentations as well. Sorry to miss the entire discussion.
Thank you.
Sure.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Yeah. Can we respond? Can we ask questions to one another?
Excuse me?
Can we ask questions to one another?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. This is absolutely.
Thor has been baiting me a lot, and I have to say that.
Sure, let's get to it. Yeah.
No, I like it. Well, because I have this idea that Thor has an idea of what the law looks like, how the law should be composed, and what the outlook of the law should be. I come from state-led societies. Those people who didn't have states, who functioned very well, and their understanding of law is not actually what you have in mind. And in fact, one of the authors of the English School of International Law, one of the precursors, right, Hedley Bull, when he talks about international society, his example is the newer, right, stateless societies. Your conception of law is already tragically bound up in a state, in a concept of a state and concept of sovereignty and the power to take life and to dispense of life. It is already, you are so far gone already in imagining that if I'm doing a critique of law, I don't have an imaginary back to fall on, that the imaginary just has to be, the fallback has to be law of state in the way that is conceived post-Enlightenment in Europe. That is not the kind of law actually I imagine myself when I'm criticizing, when I'm appealing to law. It's not the kind of law I'm appealing to. But I do understand that we actually need to be guided in some fashion. Right? So the ethical predicate of what you imagine to be law are not the ones I'm imagining at all.
Yeah, but I wonder, I'm not sure we're actually disagreeing in our critique of X, right? I'm calling it law because look, sure, we could say that any kind of social regulation from time immemorial we're going to call law, or we can give law, or international law, some specificity, and so I'm sympathetic to Pasha Canis's commodity form theory of law. I think law, as we understand it today, how it operates, is coeval with the emergence of capitalism. It's a capitalist social form. International law, when I'm critiquing international law and describing what I think the problems with international law are, or the dangers of invoking it, I'm perfectly happy to agree with you. It's a very specific and narrow understanding of what international law is. I would suggest it's the understanding that holds sway, is dominant in the kinds of discussions that I'm critiquing. So I don't think we're actually disagreeing.
Okay.
Except potentially semantically.
Okay, thank you.
Oof, that's a relief. All right.
But
Kamari?
Much to Kamari's disappointment.
No, I think that there's a place for a critique of aspiration, and I think that that's where your point is quite powerful, and that there's an affectivity to that aspiration, and the reality is that there's a dialectical relationship that something like Black Lives Matter has to the law. So you said that one of the things that's great about this grassroots movement is that it's not, justice isn't dependent on law. In fact, it's founded on its disappointment, the disappointment with the law. But there is a dialectical relationship in which there's an aspiration that perhaps the law can be deployed to do the right thing, right? So you expect a verdict that will adjudicate around the death of an individual who is a Black woman, and you get quite the opposite. Therefore, there are protests, etc., and there's an anticipation that that will be the case. And I think that it's that tension, the possibility that this law, Big L, can one day be used can be deployed to do the right thing, to actually adjudicate over the loss of the corporality of this person who was a living being, who was a human, who lived and who was innocent. And that's not the case. And so I think that there is an important point there about the aspiration of law, big letter L. But, in another conversation, we can perhaps follow with Siba's point to continue to think about what we actually mean when we think about other possibilities around social ordering, around norms, around adjudication that exist in the absence of a black letter book, that are about other ways of making sense of what people in a society feel is permissible and what actually is seen as abhorrent and unacceptable. So I think these are much bigger conversations, and you're right to raise them. And let's say webinar number 2, we can return to that, because that is about, what is it that we look to for a different kind of future, both analytically as scholars, but also pragmatically as we think about the way that we want to deploy a new social order that can actually attend to social inequality.
Can I come in there quickly?
Sure, absolutely. We have a few more minutes left, and I know that some of our participants, our panelists, have to leave. But absolutely, Christopher. And then maybe Kamari afterwards, we can have some final thoughts. And please, Christopher.
So just on the points of law, what I found so provocative and helpful about Kamari's book is that so much of what she dissembles about international criminal justice has nothing to do with the law, right? It has to do with the regimes of representations, the historical narratives, the affect that these communities share in different ways. And that whereas in so many times the debate about Africa and the ICC takes place on this narrow legal formalism, I think what you show quite powerfully, and this is borne out in my experience of these arguments, is that so much of that undergirding has nothing to do with the law. It has to do with understandings of justice, of affect, of relationality, of history. And I think that finding a language and a vocabulary for me to be able to start to unpack those is precisely what the book allowed me to do. So I think it's important to have the law there as a frame, but I think what you allowed me to do is to, in some sense, push that narrow formalism to the side and start to hold people account for what's really driving a conception of justice, a conception of history, a conception of politics. And I think that's really the power of the book, to me at least.
Excellent.
Can I say one?
Please, Katherine, please.
I just wanted to, in some ways, jump on this comment and pick up on something that you said, Kamari, just a moment ago that I thought was so compelling, which is that, first of all, there's this kind of dialectical relationship between the sort of outside of law and the inside of law, or the law's proceduralism or whatever. But the other thing that I found actually, maybe this isn't what you were saying, but I thought earlier you said something really interesting, which is that it can be in the moments that law fails, right? Where the failure of law becomes so visible, or the failure of law to secure justice that becomes so visible, that you have this sort of dialectical movement to a different kind of, the aspiration that takes a different form, right? And that this itself can actually push things in other ways, right? So that law's failure itself can be productive, which I found very compelling.
Joking, and then yeah, please, and then Kamari.
Tempting. Anyway, yeah, okay.
Yeah. I just want to also just say why this book is important, just drawing from something Carl said, in offering a language. So it provides us a language, what I would call the grammars. It gives us a grammar to speak about injustice beyond the material. So I like what even Kamari was saying. You cannot, even when you meet people who have faced human rights violations, they talk about the immediate, even though and bringing the whole COVID discussion in and be like Black Lives Matter, even though the injustices have been happening over a long period of time because of those legacies of historical injustice, which they embody, and I like that idea of embodied affect. They may not talk about it, they may not even know about it at that time, but this book gives us a language, so grammars of injustice to talk about this and to acknowledge that, which is not often, which we know exists, especially for us as racialized people, as people who faced injustice or colonialism or whatever. But we don't have a language because it's always talked about as emotional or it's not researchable. So thank you for giving us that grammar of injustice to talk about.
Excellent, fantastic. It's a really tremendous way to end, both by my apologies, both by thanking Kamari and also congratulating her on such an important piece of work, and also of assembling us today. I mean, this is just one moment, and I'm sure a continued conversation that'll revolve around this piece of work and its implications in today's society. So again, thank you so much and congratulations.
Great.
And thank you to our panelists as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Voilà.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
So we leave now?